Ladies and gentlemen, welcome the moderator of the next session, Lise.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon to you all and to our audience online or here in Bratislava. My name is Lise. I'm Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for Data Innovation, and it's an honor to be here today and get a chance to moderate this panel on 5G. Is 5G a medicine for post-COVID recovery? I'd like to thank the GLOBSEC team for providing us with such fantastic organized, super well-organized event today. I think the job you've been doing to make this work is incredible. I will first introduce our guests before we dive into this conversation, and we'll be planning some time for questions and answers from our delegates to our discussants. So you'll be able, as the audience, to either raise a hand in this room and then walk to the microphone here, or post questions via the forum's virtual platform by typing your question at live.globsec.org or by connecting into the virtual studio via Zoom. This event is being streamed via Facebook Live, so feel free to share the stream on social media and engage on Twitter using the hashtag GLOBSEC2020 and GLOBSEC's Twitter handle. To set the scene first, some food for thought. The EU has recognized that the goal should be to facilitate the longer-term twin transition towards a greener, more digital Europe. The rapid deployment of 5G, which is the largest open innovation platform ever, has a crucial role to play. Indeed, 5G is going to drive economic growth for decades to come, but is also now seen as a key driver of economic recovery. Now, while the pandemic has caused delays in 5G implementation, the crisis also underscored the importance of its swift and effective deployment. And business leaders and scientists from the G20 member states have voiced the urgent need to improve digital infrastructure in response to the pandemic, highlighting that, simply put, we must choose between putting full 5G at the heart of our recovery or letting Europe become a laggard with a slow and fragmented transition. At the same time, though, part of the civil society has raised concerns and reluctance with respect to health and environmental concerns when it comes to 5G deployment, and that has to be addressed as well. So how can policymakers overcome procedural roadblocks and resistant stakeholders and allow 5G to play a significant role in the post-pandemic recovery? Well, with me today to discuss this great topic in more depth, and thank you all for joining, I have Heli Tiirma-Klaar, Ambassador at Large Cybersecurity at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Estonia, joining us from Tallin. Anthony Whelan, Digital Advisor to the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, connecting with us from Brussels. Lise, Director General of ETNO, the Association of European Telecommunications Network Operators based in Brussels. Joyce Hakmeh, Senior Research Fellow, International Security Program, Co-Editor, Journal of Cyber Policy at Chatham House, joining us from London. And last but not least, Ulf Pearson, Head of Government and Industry Relations of Ericsson. Thank you all for joining. Let me start with you, Joyce. So 5G does not just represent an incremental shift from 4G, does it? It's not just about better connectivity for consumers, not just about downloading movies in 3 seconds in some elevators. So what are the realities behind it? Can you tell us what sorts of benefits, innovation, and progress it will enable once it is adopted?
Thank you, Eileen, and thank you for the GLOBSEC team for this invitation. It's such an honor to be here with you today and to be amongst this distinguished panel. So as you correctly said, Eileen, 5G is a transformative technology. It is known, or it is actually the fifth generation of mobile technology. And as we might know, every probably 10 years, we have a new generation that comes along. So 5G has been referred to as the central nervous system of the 21st century. What it does is actually, or the key features of this generation, or this new generation, is one, faster mobile broadband speed, ultra-reliable low-latency communications, and massive machine-to-machine communications. So what does that actually mean? So the 5G, or the fifth generation of mobile technology, is the technology that will allow artificial intelligence, that will allow the Internet of Things technology that is needed for driverless cars, for automated factories, and for smart cities and digital economies more generally to function seamlessly. So in essence, 5G is critical to any country that is aspiring to achieve economic success and digital transformation, as you rightly pointed out in your introductory remarks. Now, there are different views on how quickly it will become commonplace and what form it will take. But what is really indisputable is that 5G will become critical to the functioning of governments, to the functioning of companies, and to the functioning of societies more generally. So the countries that will deploy 5G securely, and that is an important point that I'd like to highlight, is will be able to compete in the global market. And the countries that will adopt 5G and other emerging technology and help shaping its use will gain not just economic advantage, but also military and political strength for decades to come. So because 5G is so crucial, as I said, to government, companies, and societies, its security is of utmost importance. And I probably come at it from that point of view. So thinking about its deployment, we also need to think very carefully about the cybersecurity and the security of the deployment, because we need to be concerned about the attacks against networks using the 5G technology and the implications and the major real-world consequences that this will have, ranging from major disruptions to real physical harm and to actually unprecedented consequences. So 5G is transformative technology. It will change the way in which we interact with each other, in which governments and companies perform, but the deployment needs to be very much accompanied with cyber secure deployment of the technology.
Thank you so much, Joyce, and thank you for highlighting those critical aspects of 5G for the competitiveness of industry, and especially aspects of security do clearly matter. Anthony Willen, from the European Commission's perspective, so clearly we've said it, 5G is critical for competitiveness of industry. Cybersecurity is also important, but so is a common approach for member states in the EU. So how can we close the ranks on 5G? I know that there's been a recommendation on a common toolbox from the Commission to member states to streamline the efforts. How can member states ensure rapid, secure, robust deployment of networks together? What are some of the right steps that are needed to move forward with the 5G action plan in particular?
Well, Aline, first of all, I'm also to be able to participate in today's session. I'm grateful to GLOBSEC for this opportunity to speak important topics. Our recommendation on 5G Security Toolbox, if it had stopped there, of course, we wouldn't be in such a good place. But in fact, that recommendation kick-started conversations that were already, of course, taking place with national authorities, but really brought them to a new level where states themselves have adopted their toolbox. This is a common work of the cybersecurity authorities of the member states in what's called the NIS group, to establish what we see as a distinctively European approach to some of the key cybersecurity issues in 5G. Linked, of course, to its transformational character. It is more than just more bits and bytes per second or millisecond. It's also the way in which it will be woven into our industrial fabric, our public services fabric, and our transport fabric, and much more. What we have seen is that we have been able together to form an objective approach to 5G cybersecurity risks. And this is not only the one, of course, the headlines about more or less high-risk suppliers. That's a very important aspect of the whole puzzle, and one where I think we have reached a very good balance between laying out common criteria for a European approach with focus on the core and certain sensitive parts of the access network, but also looking ahead to the really important industrial stage of standalone 5G, possibly in another 2 years or so, when really the whole of the network it can be regarded as pretty much a sensitive asset. Now, that's a balance drawn between objective criteria agreed among the member states and the member states' individual authority for their own national security. And they are now conducting more advanced than others, their analysis and drawing their conclusions on that. And I think that is inevitably how it has to happen in Europe on security questions. But apart, as I said, from the sensitive supplier question, we have also very substantial consensus among member states more generally on diversification of supply, on a certain number of controls that need to be conducted. And this, I think, can be regarded as a success story for European cybersecurity policy to date.
Thank you so much, Anthony Whelan, from the Commission's perspective. Now I'll ask Ambassador Tiirma-Klaar, perhaps you have some comment on this common approach and the level of consensus among EU member states. And just maybe you could, not sure you can comment on that, but I know that EU member states that will not have assigned 5G spectrum frequencies by the end of the year could face legal sanction from the Commission. So maybe you'd have something to contribute on that too.
Yeah, thank you. It is true that not all member states have assigned those frequencies yet, but it doesn't mean that they haven't been dealing with the issue of 5G security. Because I think one of the very important elements of the Commission toolbox was also the risk assessment, which was coordinated between the member states and put together by ENISA. So I think the risk assessment quite importantly notes that increased exposure to attacks and more potential entry points for attackers will be likely. With 5G networks are increasingly based on software, there are risks related to major security flaws, such as those deriving from software development and software updates. Increased exposure to risks related to the reliance of mobile network operators will be happening, and this will be also leading to a higher number of attacks paths that might be exploited by threat actors and increase the potential severity of the impact of such attacks. In this context of increased exposure to attacks facilitated by suppliers, the risk profile of individual suppliers will become particularly important, including the likelihood of supplier being subjected to interference from a non-EU country. So the increased risks from major dependencies on suppliers will be addressed by all member states, and threats to availability and integrity of networks will become a major security concerns, both from the privacy and confidentiality, integrity, and other parts of the cybersecurity aspects. As was pointed out before, the 5G networks are expected to become the backbone of many future critical services, not just anymore the telecommunications services, but the Internet of Things, self-driving cars, your toasters talking to your coffee makers, and all this new world out there that we are not experiencing yet, but we will in 5 years' time. So all the member states had at the same time then to deal with the issue of risk management and how the 5G risks from cybersecurity perspective will be mitigated. And at the same time, the frequency allocation process. I think the allocation process was maybe less complex than finding a good national solution for 5G risk management. I can, of course, speak for Estonia, but at least I think in our case we had a very complex, long process for 5G risk management nationally. And we came up with a solution of changing the legislation and adding some additional regulations in our electronic communications law.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Turning to the industry's perspectives now, starting with you, Lise, for Ethno. So I have a few questions. Bear with me here. So we're talking about a race to 5G to a certain extent because of what so much is at stake. I wonder if you could tell me more about how well Europe is doing on deployment compared to other players, for instance, China or the US. Who is leading, who's lagging? For instance, I know there's no US manufacturer for 5G, but some say also Europe is up the pace when it comes to leading in connectivity. And another part of my question would be, so now talking about first deployment, how can the delays due to the pandemic, how will they affect that deployment, do you think? And what could be the right policies to support faster deployment of 5G in the current conditions?
Well, thank you, Eline, and thank you for inviting Ethno to speak at this very important event, and it's a timely event right now. Where Europe is, it is a race. 5G is going to be extremely important for all of Europe. We heard it, it's our European industry, it's our European competitiveness that will be depending on 5G. If we look at it, European operators are investing 49 billion a year, and I must say 70% come from the ETNO members. So that is fine, but if we look at where the issues are, it's actually the investment per capita in Europe is 90 euros per person, which is much lower. It's a double in the US, it's double in South Korea, in Japan. And why is this? We think there are a couple of reasons. One is the market is still too fragmented. We think there are lots of cost, rollout cost and cost of spectrum. I know the Commission is looking into this now. I think the new toolbox on this area is important. And also, of course, we need to have the pro-investment of the code still needs to be implemented in all the member states. So when all this is done, we have the basis for good investment. If we look at where we are in Europe, we actually rolled out 20 5G networks last year. That was in 9 countries. We hope to have 80 more by the end of this year. But we still need a lot of investment, and that's important. If you look at the COVID situation, and you asked about this, that has, of course, an effect, because whatever we need to go forward and to have the European recovery is closely connected to digital, also the Green Deal. So everything will be connected to the infrastructure that should be in place. And McKinsey did a report for the European Commission on this, and they actually say that the mobile ecosystem is accounting for more than 4% of the region's GDP in 2022. But we have a gap in Europe, an investment gap of 350 billion euro. So we still have some things that need to be in place before we can have a digital infrastructure in Europe that is up to the international level. And we actually see also from the McKinsey report, this will be good for the industry, because there will be a GDP contribution of new digital technologies that could amount to 2.2 trillion in the EU. So there are big opportunities here, but we still need to have more investment.
Thank you so much. I imagine the crisis is not necessarily helpful in this context, obviously. Ulf Pearson, for Ericsson, so you probably have some comments on, clearly how the EU should step up its game in terms of deployment, and how kind of policies could be helpful to address all the issues that Lise mentioned, for instance, fragmented market, costly rollout, the security issues as well. And another part of my question would be, are our European champions like Ericsson and Nokia, and for South Korea, Samsung, are these strong enough to in terms of market power and further matter in the 5G market.
Thank you, Aline, and thanks to GLOBSEC for inviting me to this very important event. Well, first, just comparing situation of Europe with other regions like Asia or North America. Yes, Europe as a whole, as a region, is lagging behind on 5G, but there are countries in Europe that were very early out with 5G, like Switzerland with Swisscom, that actually built nationwide coverage of 5G with Ericsson already last year in 2019. But of course, if you look at the leading pioneering nations like South Korea and US, we have to recognize that they built out 5G with Ericsson and other Western vendors. And the first standalone network in the world which is in the US with T-Mobile, is supported by Ericsson and another Western company. So it's clear to establish that if Europe is behind in the launch of the technology, it's not because the lack of European vendors or Western vendors. And referring to what Lise said, there are other elements in this, the investment climate, the lack of spectrum, etc., etc. And so what Europe needs to do now, I mean, we are late to the game, but it's not too late. We can still step up, and we can see that only 12 EU member states have 5G roadmaps. 25% of the 5G spectrum has been released, and the investment levels, as Lise said, are still too low. So I think European policymakers must not choose between putting full 5G, as you referred to it in your opening statement, at the heart of Europe's economic recovery, or allowing Europe to become a laggard. And just to refer to a study that was commissioned by Ericsson together with Qualcomm from Analysis Mason, just to quote another number, they concluded that digital transformation based on 5G could bring net economic benefits of more than 160 billion euros. And the main benefits would come from production through smart manufacturing, rural, both smart agriculture, and also making use of fixed wireless access, which is a very strong component enabling suburban and rural broadband coverage coming from 5G, but also smart construction and public services. So, of course, the signal from the European Council and the European Commission that 20% of recovery and resilience funding should go to digital, I think it's quite natural. And you referred in the end to the security. I think the EU Toolbox is an excellent example of how to address this. Anthony talked about it in detail. And as a European vendor, we think it's important that it's being implemented in all 27 member states in a harmonized way as well, not to make it more complex for vendors like Ericsson to meet the requirements, but at the same time guaranteeing a very high level of security. And I think the EU Toolbox could also serve as a model for other countries around the world in how to address the 5G security in a very holistic fashion.
Thank you for your insights. Now, back to you, Anthony Whelan, from the Commission's perspective. You've heard the industry's perspective. 12 member states have a roadmap, and there are some challenges, like a fragmented market and a costly rollout. Do you think the recovery plans that the EU has tabled are sufficiently taking all that into account and will address the 5G priority sufficiently?
Thanks, Aline. And from all that's been said already, obviously, there are a number of factors at work. When you speak of recovery plans, obviously the individual national recovery plans are still in the making, and we'll be seeing those coming through in the coming months. But we have a very strong signal with the overall 20% digital objective, which Ulf just mentioned for the recovery fund, but also in the signaling of what we call the 7 European flagships, that one of those should be in the area of connectivity with 5G, of course, getting the limelight. So we're sending a strong message to the member states that this should be included in their planning in order not just in short-term crisis sort of demand replacement, but really to prepare their economies for a better post-crisis future. In addition, it's not just a matter of having public money in place for areas where there's likely to be market failures, such as rural areas or perhaps along transport routes, which are a very important potential use case. We need to have other elements of the ecosystem in place. So, for example, the EU for a number of years has been working very hard with the 5G partnership on trialing transport corridors, because we see this as an area where you need things ready for when that ecosystem is ready to go. Directly after the President's State of the Union speech, where she highlighted the need for 5G investment through the Recovery Fund, we brought out additional best practice recommendations to member states on how they can facilitate the deployment in ways that don't cost anything, by getting back on track with well-designed spectrum assignments, for example, by taking administrative steps to facilitate deployment, because there's still plenty of log jams there that individual operators have to face. We, of course, want to see, as Lise, some of the opportunity of network sharing being exploited in order to speed things up. But the final thing I would say is, I think we're still at early days, where we're seeing fairly massive first moves in China and South Korea, for example. We're in the massive download experience, and we're seeing huge consumer response to that in those countries. But where we see the transformational opportunity of 5G is in the transport, industrial, and other applications, areas where European industry is extremely strong, and where we believe we can keep the momentum in order to take a leading role there, based on the trialing and other tech work that's going on in Europe right now.
Thank you very much. Back to you, Lise, just real briefly, because we've heard the ambassador mention the case of Estonia, and there are some interesting use cases that perhaps you could share. Tell us more about, which member states are leading the charge when it comes to deployment of 5G.
Well, we have a couple of member states that are showing some extremely interesting use cases. An example, Estonia is a very good example. It's very digitized, and it has a lot of also governmental demand for it. You can do anything online, so you can use digital tools for buying houses, doing things like that you somewhere need to go to by physical presence. Sweden has a very good example of e-health, where they actually use 5G to have a mammography truck that can drive out to the citizens and give them mammography, and so they don't need to travel 300 kilometers to the nearest hospital, and many are not coming to the appointments, so instead the mammography truck comes to the citizens. But you need 5G to actually have the quality to send those pictures to the hospital. You also have an example of Portugal, where they are using 5G to smart cities, smart mobility. So and here you would actually bring down the carbon emission. So you can use the technology to make people's life easier, but also to fulfill the Green Deal that we all are trying to work towards.
Thank you, Lise, for those examples. Joyce, I'd like to bring you back because we've talked quite a bit about the security, what's at stake when it comes to security and cybersecurity. And perhaps you have some comments after everything that you've heard. But another way in which I'd like to bring you back in would be to ask you how the EU should deal with pressure from US and China. Is it stuck in the middle because of a lack of an alternative technological positioning or existing dependencies? Can we be selective when it comes to the providers that we work with, especially when we know this is all against the background of a narrative of technological sovereignty that the EU is striving for?
I believe it is wrong to think and look at 5G as the end of the technological race, right? So 5G is what we are discussing now, but I think when it comes to technological development, in having a long-term vision is extremely important. So I believe, having these a focus on how we can develop and commercialize technology within 5G, but also look at, for example, other emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, 6G, quantum computing. So I think it's very, very important to have a long-term vision to overcome the roadblocks that currently exist. But in terms of how do we approach the existing situation, I think there has to be a combination of different measures, and I believe the previous speakers have highlighted some of them. I think there's a very big focus on the importance of diversification of vendors as an extremely important condition for having a more resilient 5G network. I think there has to be initiatives and policies, for example, and regulations, policies, for example, on the for competition and for mergers to ensure that a fairness for new entrants. So I think the EU needs to focus, the EU and other countries as well need to focus on giving opportunities for new entrants to be able to compete in the future in the emerging technologies that I mentioned, but to also play a role in 5G, because as some of the speakers mentioned, 5G is now partially deployed and there will be a lot of developments that are yet to come. I think the investment in research and development is an extremely important one. Testing facilities for 5G networks. So if you can't ask for diversification without providing some support to understand what is secure and what is not. So there has to be some sort of vendor risk ratings, testing facilities similar to the one that exists here in the UK that has been looking into the security of the Huawei equipment since the early 2000s. That is a good practice. I think there's also, we talk about deployment, we talk about cybersecurity, but an important point as well is talking about how can we shape this this technology in the future. And on this point, the importance of engaging in standard setting is extremely important, technical standard setting, which is now currently taking place in 3GPP on 5G. That is an extremely important area of focus that the EU should be paying more attention and also investment and have some clarity in terms of who's leading the work, what are the priority areas, and how can we ensure that whatever the standards that are developed avoid politicization, provide a market opportunity for new entrants, and also give choices that maximize overall security and resilience.
Thank you so much. Joyce, perhaps Ulf from Ericsson, you've heard interesting things about fairness for new entrants and competition. What is your angle on what Joyce mentioned when it comes to that? And also, so Joyce mentioned risk grading, standard setting. Is there a little bit the way we see it with AI, some sort of an international cooperation that the EU is developing or should be deploying with its allies or partners or like-minded countries?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And start with the competition issue and also sort of vendors, vendor choice, etc. I think it's important to stress that especially outside Europe, when you look at vendor choice, etc., it's not about promoting a certain vendor or anything like that. It has been very much focused on national security, putting that ahead of any national interest or sort of promoting vendors from certain countries, etc. So I think there the focus has been a lot on and exclusively, I would say, on national security. When it comes to the Europe way of addressing security, and it's slightly in contrast to what Joyce said about testing, etc. I think it's extremely important when you look at security of 5G networks. You need to look at it in a holistic way. Of course, you need to look at the standards, but I think the 5G standard is very much, it's an open standard, global standard, that is very much focused on security in a different way and a much stronger way than earlier generations. Then, of course, you need to look at the vendor, the production, supply chain of the vendor, etc. But then a lot of the security is within the responsibility of the operator in the deployment of the network, and especially how it's being operated 24/7. So in order to have a truly secure 5G network, you need to look at the whole in this, as I said, holistic way. I think so testing of a certain vendor's product will not help you get to that stage. Also, of course, the networks are continuously updated with new software, so whatever you tested is for sure something that you will not find in the network in operation. And still, it's only a small part of the whole value chain. And competition, I think it is a very competitive market. I mean, I've been in this industry for nearly 20 years, and I think you can say it's brutally competitive. And I think a sign of the competitiveness is the achievement of this sector and building on global standards like 3G, 4G, and now 5G. Establishing a very accessible technology. That there are more people using mobile phones than are using toothbrushes. It's not my favorite example, but I mean, it's the most widely spread technology, and it's not that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't very price competitive. So it is an open market. It is an open global standard. But on your last question there, Eileen, on cooperation. Yes, I think we should cooperate much more across the Atlantic, but also globally on these issues, and including AI, of course. And sometimes I think that the sort of a rivalry between EU and America, US, is exaggerated. I mean, we are strong, but we are strong in different parts of the value chain for 5G, AI, cloud, etc. And I think we should gain more from cooperating here and value the strength of the other side than trying to create our own champions in every field.
Thanks very much for this valuable perspective. I'd like to ask each of you to come in with some comments about public concerns, because this is really the part of the discussion that we haven't mentioned yet. We've talked about security, about what policy can do, about competition. But there is a pushback against 5G in some member states, and I'm wondering just if this is anything new compared to previous innovation, which I was maybe too young to witness, like 4G, and what does that really tell us about the perception of technologies among the general public, and how can we really address those concerns? Of course, there's some concerns that are more off the wall, and some others are more legitimate. Ambassador Tiirma-Klaar, would you like to comment on this side of the debate?
Well, in Estonia, there is no public animosity against any technology, so maybe Estonian is not the right pick for this question. But what I can see, of course, worldwide is that there is a general uncertainty amongst the populations because of the very rapid increase in using artificial intelligence, other new technologies, and maybe 5G has been seen as a manifestation of all these changes that have happened in the marketplace, and also the labor structure is changing. So we have seen all this data, how maybe around 40% of the employees have to re-educate themselves because the AI might be doing their own jobs much more efficiently. So, and when we look at the data of how technology and automation of the industry will be used in the future and what kind of economic impact it will have. So I think there is this general sense of the public that this might be dangerous for them. So I can see the reasons.
Well, it seems that
But
in
I have to
Estonia,
say, in Estonia, we don't have that.
Well, that's probably some lessons learned we should take from that then. Let me turn to Lise, because I know that Edno published a survey with Ipsos, and is it really looking that bad? What are the findings of that result? And how can we generate better public awareness, if that helps?
Thank you, Eileen, and that's a very important question. Yes and no, I could say to your question, is it really that bad? I think it's extremely important that we acknowledge the fear and the criticism of the electromagnetic fields. That needs to be addressed. Of course, we know a lot of people are afraid of radiation and other things. What's important for me here is that we actually look at conspiracy theories, we look at misinformation, and we actually fight back with information and with science. And this because I think it's not only the telcos who are hit by this, this is a broader thing, and we need to make sure that any misinformation is pushed back on. But back to the Ipsos survey, we released it this week. It's extremely interesting because if you look at it, we have 96% of all people know about 5G. Not very well, but they are aware of it. And the vast majority is actually positive about it. They think it's important for innovation of Europe. So you have 54, that are positive, you have 36 that are neutral, and you have 10% that are negative. Of course, these 10% needs to be addressed, and it's important, but those 10% get a lot of attention online. So it's not all of our citizens. It's 10% that are creating myths and also fake news. And what we see is that those myths and fake news are creating an uncertainty among citizens. So while people are very positive about 5G, they also don't know if they believe in a myth. So we have a huge responsibility to actually inform these. But the good thing is they actually believe what is being sent out of scientific evidence from the government and also from the telcos. They think they are reliable sources, which is extremely important. But then we see it's only 8% of the people we ask in 23 member states in Europe, that actually learned about 5G from the governments. So my plea is for the governments to help us inform, because we need material and information that is factual and can give the best possible information about what 5G is, and certainly also what it isn't.
Thanks, Lise. Anthony Whelan, then. So governments are still trusted, and positive attitudes are correlated with better awareness and information, but there is a crucial problem, which is misinformation and disinformation when it comes to 5G. What are some of the action points of the commissions and the commitments when it comes to tackling those issues?
Yeah, well, Aline, on disinformation generally, if we're in a new wave of relation to COVID and so on, we have a pretty broad agenda which includes work, for example, with the platforms through a code of practice that exists, where we notice improvements, although there's still a lot of progress to be made on the ranking and promotion of authoritative sources on prominent questions, of which, of course, the 5G concerns are one. More generally, I think on concerns, we have to concern not by dismissing these concerns, but by engaging with them. There is, of course, a starting point of truth. There is a potential health concern with high levels of EMF from any source. 5G is only one of many that can emit EMF. The important thing is to engage with people to show this is not a binary on-off question. It's about the levels, and the levels recommended in Europe, as recently reconfirmed by the unpronounceable ICNIRP, are grosso modo 50% below the level at which they could be concerned. I mean, this is massively precautionary, if you want to talk about the precautionary principle. Now, we for quite some time for the ICNIRP report to come through in March. I think it can now be useful through our own scientific bodies at EU level to examine the outcome of that through very objective assessment to see whether we can also put our behind it. But for the moment, I think the scientific case is fairly well laid out.
Thank you very much. If I may add a bit of a provocative comment, it seems to me when it comes to generating trust for new technologies, when we talk about AI, it's clearly an issue. A lot of people are, wondering what are the risks, but you have governments often commenting on the risks of that technology. And when it comes to 5G, it seems that governments are actually supportive of that technology. So I just a thought that occurred to me that it could be very helpful to also focus conversations about technology in general in a more opportunity-oriented way. But that's just a side comment. And I'd like to bring Joyce back in the discussion. How do you think we should engage with those public concerns, and how should we address them, really? I know that in Paris there's an idea for a referendum or a public debate to create some safeguards and guidelines around 5G deployment. So what would be your contribution to that side of the discussion?
Yeah, thank you, Eileen. And I also agree with you around, sometimes the problem is at the decision level makers, and we hear a lot of sometimes misinformation at that level as well. And this is not obviously just in the context of the EU, but more globally. We feel we see a lot of governments who have misinterpretation, misunderstanding about crucial issues when it comes to technology. Now, how do we address the issues around it? I think, like with every emerging problem, I think it requires a whole of society approach. The previous speakers talked about what governments can do, about the important role of research that can come into this. And I think really the way we should approach it has to be a combination of these different approaches and tools. And there are some other areas that we can learn from and apply them to the 5G area. So I think there are these conspiracy theories that need to be demystified, but I also think there is a genuine need for research that look at the different aspects of 5G. It is a challenge, of course, because 5G and the way it will manifest itself after its full deployment is still an area that is yet to be understood by a lot of stakeholders. And it's really important that not just the vendors, not just the telecom operators are engaged in this debate, and that we broaden it up and we take it out of this sort of like boutique approach. And it is true that when we talk about 5G, a lot of the concerns have been focused on national security, on a certain relationship to governments, etc. But there are other areas that need to be highlighted and need to be brought into the forefront as well. I mentioned testing and evaluation. I believe this is actually quite an important approach when it comes to new technology, to understand how these new technologies are being deployed and identify the security issues that arise. I think that could be a helpful way to engage in a constructive way with how the technology is developing.
Thank you, Joyce. Ulf, would you like to comment?
Yes, happy to, and I agree a lot what was said about the EMF limits, the electromagnetic fields, and of course we've seen this in every generation shift from we saw that from 2G to 3G, we see it from 4G to 5G, so there's nothing new, and I think as Anthony said, I mean, there are international limits agreed. We are far below those limits that would pose any kind of health risk. So we need to keep this dialogue very much fact-based, and we are contributing from Ericsson's side on that. And we can just conclude that years of independent and academically robust research has showed that there's no link between the use of mobile phones and human health. But I should say also in Europe, it's important that we address this in a harmonized way, because we see, of course, that country-wise and sometimes also regionally or even by city, there are decisions, political decisions, to impose sort of own home-invented levels that would be more secure, so to speak. And of course, this would lead to I mean, it would not in any way increase the health and safety of citizens, but it would slow down the uptake of technology, so it wouldn't really be helpful. But I would just like to add another aspect, because I think it's important to emphasize that the evolution in the next few years needs to be both digital and green. And there's no, they are not sort of put against each other. We can be both digital and green, and I think digital will help to make our societies and our companies greener through more efficiencies, etc. And we have shown from Ericsson in what we call breaking the energy curve, that for the first time, when you move from one generation to the other, we don't see that it's necessary to increase the electricity and energy consumption from running those networks. So actually by applying technology and rolling out networks in a good way, you can actually reduce the energy consumption of these networks. And we have to remember also, because there's a lot of debate that 5G is very energy intense. The whole ICT industry, including data centers, etc., represents less than 2% of the world's global footprint, carbon footprint. Sorry, and through applying new technology in a good way, we can actually reduce that. And most importantly, we can use our technology to reduce the carbon footprint of other sectors. So I think that's also an important element that we need to explain, that digital and green goes together and actually can reinforce each other.
Thank you very much. I think these would be the final words, because we have to wrap up the session. Thank you all so much for tuning in and joining in person. And let's give a round of applause to our fantastic speakers here. Thank you. Thank you all. Now, before we close, I wanted to mention GLOBSEC's Digital Lighthouse Initiative, which is a public-private platform shaping policy debates in the area of digital transformation and innovations in the Central and Eastern Europe region. The platform connects key stakeholders from the public and the private sector through series of webinars, policy papers, and other communication channels. And the idea is really to create a dialogue related to the developing field of technology and innovation policy. So they've organized some events in the past with Commissioner Maria Gabriel. So this is just a little word of information for you all. Now you can watch the next session live streamed here to hear NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg's speech about NATO's 2030 agenda and future allied security. Then after the coffee break at 3:55, please join us back here for a session on hybrid threats to democracy, or during the session on NATO with the defense ministers of Slovakia, Latvia and Canada in the Maria Theresia room. Thank you all very much for joining us today, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.